Imagine this. A nation barely 50 years old, struggling to define itself, celebrating democracy and liberty in its founding documents, while at the same time planning the mass removal of entire peoples from their homelands. And at the very center of this contradiction stands one man. A man adored by the crowds as a champion of the common man, but feared and hated by those who stood in his path. A man who called himself the defender of freedom, while condemning thousands to death. That man was Andrew Jackson, 7th President of the United States, general, politician, slaveholder, an architect of one of the darkest chapters in American history. The Indian Removal Act and the forced marshes we now remember as the Trail of Tears. But how did he rise to such power? And what shaped the cruelty that defined his presidency? To understand, we need to go back to the beginning. Andrew Jackson was born in 1767 in the Waxhaws region between North and South Carolina. His father died before he was even born. His childhood was marked by hardship, poverty, and most importantly, violence. As a boy, Jackson lived through the American Revolution. At age 13, he joined the local militia. When captured by the British, a soldier ordered him to polish his boots. Jackson refused. The soldier slashed the boy with his sword, leaving scars on his face and hand that he carried for life. His mother and brothers would die during the war, leaving Andrew an orphan at 14. The lesson Jackson took from these years was brutal. The world was merciless. Survival meant fighting, and compassion was a weakness. By his 20s, Jackson had trained as a lawyer and moved west to the Tennessee frontier. But law was never his true calling. Jackson thrived in the rough-and-tumble world of duels, militias, and politics. He was a gambler, a slaveholder, and above all, a fighter. His reputation was forged in violence. He fought in dozens of duels, killing at least one man. He built wealth through enslaved labor, owning hundreds of enslaved people over his lifetime. And he made his name as a military commander during America's expansion wars against Native Americans. The Creek War of 1813 to 1814 would cement Jackson's reputation as both a national hero and a man of ruthless cruelty. The Creek people, divided between factions, had been drawn into conflict with American settlers. Jackson, leading Tennessee militia and allied native tribes, crushed the Red Stick Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Over 800 Creek warriors were slaughtered in a single day. Women and children were not spared. When the war ended, Jackson forced the Creeks to sign away 23 million acres of land, even from tribes who had fought with him. To Jackson, allies and enemies were one and the same if they stood in the way of American expansion. In 1815, Jackson became a national hero at the Battle of New Orleans, defeating the British in a stunning victory at the end of the War of 1812. Newspapers hailed him as the savior of the nation. But behind the glory lay a darker truth. Jackson's victory relied heavily on enslaved laborers, free black troops, and Native American allies, groups he would later betray. This was the paradox of Andrew Jackson. He preached democracy for the common man, but his definition excluded African Americans, Native Americans, and women. For him, liberty was not universal. It was racial, selective, and often brutal. In the 1810s, Jackson led invasions into Florida against the Seminoles, a native group that provided refuge to escaped enslaved people. His campaigns were brutal scorched earth affairs. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, survivors driven into the swamps. When Spain protested, Jackson ignored them, essentially seizing Florida through force. His message was clear. No one, not native tribes, not foreign governments, would stop America's expansion. By the 1820s, Andrew Jackson had turned his military fame into political power. He presented himself as a man of the people, railing against elites, bankers, and aristocrats. To poor white farmers and frontiersmen, he seemed like one of their own, tough, unpolished, and unafraid to fight. But Jackson's vision of democracy was built on exclusion. He promised opportunity for white settlers by taking land from native tribes. He framed this as inevitable progress, but in reality, it was a deliberate policy of dispossession. Jackson ran for president in 1828, after narrowly losing in 1824. His campaign was one of the dirtiest in American history, filled with mudslinging, personal attacks, and vicious rhetoric. To his supporters, Jackson was the people's champion. To his opponents, he was a dangerous demagogue. But his popularity among frontier voters carried him to victory. And so, in March 1829, Andrew Jackson took the oath of office. The crowd that gathered for his inauguration was massive, rowdy, and unlike anything the capital had ever seen. Ordinary farmers, laborers, and frontiersmen flooded Washington to celebrate their hero. But while the public saw a champion, Jackson had already set his sights on a cruel project, one that would define his presidency and doom thousands to suffering. From his earliest days, Jackson had argued that native peoples could not coexist with white settlers. In his eyes, they had only two choices: assimilation or removal. And if they resisted, they would be forced out by any means necessary. In 1830, barely a year into his presidency, Jackson pushed Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act. The law gave him the authority to negotiate treaties to exchange native lands in the Southeast for lands west of the Mississippi. On paper, it sounded voluntary. In practice, it was anything but. Behind every treaty lay the threat of force, the corruption of bribes, and the looming power of the U.S. Army. The Indian Removal Act sparked fierce debate. Missionaries, politicians, and even some members of Congress warned that it was unjust and inhumane. Senator Theodore Freeling Heisen delivered a 6-hour speech condemning it. Representative Davy Crockett, a frontier hero himself, broke with Jackson and voted against removal, saying he wanted no part in the wicked, unjust measure. But Jackson's political machine was too strong. The act passed by a razor-thin margin, 102 to 97 in the House. With the stroke of a pen, Andrew Jackson had set in motion one of the greatest forced migrations in human history. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples, known to whites as the 5 civilized tribes, because of their adoption of farming, literacy, and even written constitutions, stood directly in Jackson's sights. They had lived in the Southeast for centuries. They had treaties, schools, and governments. They had done everything the U.S. had ever asked of them to prove they could coexist. And yet, none of it mattered. Their lands were fertile, rich with resources, and coveted by white settlers. Jackson intended to take them, no matter the cost. Andrew Jackson rose from orphan to war hero, from lawyer to president. He styled himself as the champion of the common man. But behind the legend was a man shaped by violence, driven by ambition, and willing to sacrifice entire peoples for his vision of America. The stage was set. The Indian Removal Act was law. And soon, the tribes of the Southeast would face a nightmare they could never have imagined. Next, in Part 2, we'll see how Jackson defied the Supreme Court, unleashed the U.S. military, and began the removals that would lead directly to the Trail of Tears. When the Indian Removal Act passed in 1830, Andrew Jackson celebrated it as a victory for progress. But for the native peoples of the Southeast, it marked the beginning of the end. This wasn't just a policy. It was a deliberate campaign of dispossession, betrayal, and death. And Jackson himself was its driving force. One of the most famous moments in Jackson's presidency came when the Cherokee Nation tried to resist removal not with weapons, but with words. The Cherokee had adopted many practices of American society. They built schools, established a written language, printed newspapers, and even drafted a constitution modeled after the United States. They believed that by proving themselves civilized, they would secure their place in the new nation. But Georgia had other plans. State leaders wanted Cherokee land and passed laws to strip the tribe of its rights. In response, the Cherokee took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. In Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall delivered a clear verdict. The Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community, and Georgia had no authority to impose its laws on them. The decision should have protected Cherokee sovereignty. But Andrew Jackson had no intention of honoring the ruling. He is often quoted, perhaps apocryphally, as saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Whether or not Jackson spoke those exact words, his actions told the story. He ignored the court entirely, leaving the Cherokee powerless. The President of the United States had openly defied the highest law in the land, and thousands would pay the price. Jackson's government began pressuring tribes into signing removal treaties. These agreements were often obtained through bribes, manipulation, or by negotiating with small, unauthorized factions instead of legitimate leaders. Take the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, 1830, which forced the Choctaw to give up millions of acres. Witnesses described the negotiations as a sham, with Choctaw leaders coerced under the threat of violence. Once the treaty was signed, the reality was devastating. The Choctaw became the first tribe forced west. Thousands marched in winter without proper supplies. One witness wrote, "It was a trail of tears and death." The phrase would later become synonymous with the Cherokee removal, but for the Choctaw, it was already reality. The Creek Nation, already devastated by earlier wars with Jackson, faced renewed pressure. By 1836, U.S. troops forcibly removed over 15,000 Creek men, women, and children. Hundreds died on the journey west. The Chickasaw, seeing what had happened to their neighbors, tried to negotiate better terms. They agreed to sell their lands and move voluntarily, but government corruption swallowed much of the promised compensation. Even those who cooperated were left destitute, suffering through the same deadly marshes as the others. Not every tribe went quietly. In Florida, the Seminole launched a fierce resistance. Led by warriors like Osceola, they fought U.S. forces in what became known as the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842. This was one of the longest and most expensive conflicts the U.S. ever fought against Native peoples. Thousands of soldiers were deployed. Entire swamps and forests became battlegrounds. But the war took a brutal toll. Osceola was captured under a flag of truce, dying in prison. Thousands of Seminoles were killed, captured, or forced west. A small remnant survived by hiding deep in the Florida Everglades. Their descendants live there to this day. Of all the removals, none is more infamous than that of the Cherokee Nation. Despite the Supreme Court ruling in their favor, despite adopting American customs, despite trying to resist through legal means, the Cherokee were doomed by greed and betrayal. In 1835, a small group of Cherokee men, without authorization from the Tribal Council, signed the Treaty of New Echota, ceding all Cherokee lands in exchange for land west of the Mississippi. The majority of the Cherokee opposed it. Their principal chief, John Ross, gathered 16,000 signatures in protest, nearly the entire Cherokee population. But Jackson and Congress ratified the treaty anyway. For Jackson, it was the legal cover he needed. For the Cherokee, it was a death sentence. By the late 1830s, the U.S. Army was ordered to enforce removal. Soldiers marched into Cherokee towns, driving families from their homes at gunpoint. Witnesses described scenes of terror. Men and women dragged from their houses, given minutes to gather belongings. Children ripped from their parents' arms. Homes, farms, and schools abandoned or destroyed. In one account, soldiers herded entire communities into stockades, open-air prisons where disease and hunger spread rapidly. From there, the forced marches began. The Cherokee removal became known as the Trail of Tears, and with good reason. Between 1838 and 1839, roughly 16,000 Cherokee were forced to march over 1,000 miles to what is now Oklahoma. They traveled through rain, snow, and freezing cold without adequate food or shelter. Eyewitnesses recorded harrowing details: old men collapsing by the roadside, mothers clutching dead infants, unwilling to let them go, frozen bodies left unburied along the trail. An estimated 4,000 Cherokee died, a quarter of the entire nation. One survivor, John Burnett, later wrote, "Murder is murder, and somebody must answer. Someone must explain the streams of blood that flowed in the Indian country in the summer of 1838. The removal was the cruelest work I ever knew." And where was Andrew Jackson during this catastrophe? By 1838, he had left office. But the removals were his legacy, his policy, his vision carried out to the letter. When criticized, Jackson defended himself. He claimed removal was actually an act of mercy, protecting native peoples from extinction by moving them away from white settlers. But this was a lie, and he knew it. The truth was written in blood across the trails of the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee. Jackson had not saved them. He had condemned them. It would be easy to blame Jackson alone, but the truth is more uncomfortable. The Indian Removal Act was passed by Congress. Settlers poured into seized lands. The press often cheered Jackson's policies. America as a whole was complicit. Jackson was the face of cruelty, but the hunger for land, wealth, and expansion ran far deeper than one man. By the late 1830s, thousands were dead, entire nations uprooted, generations scarred. Andrew Jackson had defied the courts, manipulated treaties, unleashed the military, and presided over one of the greatest forced migrations in history. But the story doesn't end here. In Part 3, we'll follow the Cherokee's final march, explore the long shadow of Jackson's policies, and confront the troubling question: how could America celebrate a man whose decisions caused so much death? By 1838, the machinery of Andrew Jackson's policy was in full motion. His presidency had ended, but the consequences of his Indian Removal Act were only beginning to unfold in their most brutal form. The Cherokee Nation, once proud and determined to coexist with the United States, now faced its darkest hour, the infamous Trail of Tears. In May 1838, under orders from Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, federal troops and state militias descended on Cherokee lands. Families were rounded up at gunpoint. The soldiers showed little mercy. Homes were ransacked, possessions stolen, livestock seized. Entire communities were forced into hastily constructed stockades, open-air prisons with little shelter, no sanitation, and meager rations. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, measles, and starvation claimed hundreds before the forced march even began. From these grim holding camps, the Cherokee were divided into groups and marched westward. The journey stretched over 1,000 miles through some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Travelers on the routes reported haunting scenes. Wagons carrying the sick and elderly broke down in mud and snow. Children stumbled barefoot on frozen ground. The cries of grief were constant. The numbers tell only part of the horror. Out of approximately 16,000 Cherokee forced to relocate, at least 4,000 died, 1 in every 4. Some perished from disease. Others starved. Many simply collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers driving the groups often denied them adequate rest, urging them forward regardless of weather or health. Eyewitness accounts remain chilling. One missionary described a mother trudging forward, clutching the lifeless body of her infant, unwilling to let go. Another recalled seeing bodies left unburied along the trail, frozen in snowdrifts. The Cherokee themselves gave the journey its name, Nana Dal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. Yet even amid despair, there were moments of resilience. Some Cherokee managed to survive by drawing on deep cultural traditions, helping one another when soldiers would not. Leaders like John Ross did everything in their power to secure better conditions, though their efforts were constantly undermined. Missionaries and sympathetic Americans occasionally provided aid, but survival came at immense cost. Entire clans were broken apart. Lands that had been cultivated for centuries were lost forever. The Cherokee would rebuild in the West, but the scars of the removal never healed. By the time the Trail of Tears ended, Andrew Jackson was retired at his Hermitage plantation in Tennessee. Though no longer president, he kept close watch on the events. To the end of his life, Jackson defended his policies. He argued that Indian removal had saved native peoples from extermination by relocating them beyond the reach of white settlers. He presented it as a benevolent policy, a necessary step for America's progress. But this was a grotesque distortion of reality. The tribes had not been saved. They had been dispossessed, brutalized, and decimated. The so-called progress Jackson spoke of came at the cost of human suffering on an unimaginable scale. It would be wrong to place all blame solely on Jackson. The truth is more unsettling. The Indian Removal Act was supported by Congress. It was carried out by soldiers, celebrated by settlers, and often ignored by much of the public. Jackson may have been the architect, but the nation as a whole was complicit. Greed for land and resources fueled the removals. Expansion westward was seen as America's destiny, even if it meant destroying those who stood in the way. The consequences of Jackson's policies extended far beyond the 1830s. The removal created a precedent for treating native nations not as sovereign peoples, but as obstacles to be managed. In the decades that followed, other tribes across the Midwestern plains would face similar fates: displacement, broken treaties, military campaigns, and massacres. The Trail of Tears became a symbol of a broader pattern: the systematic destruction of native life, culture, and land. It was not the first such tragedy, and it would not be the last. Yet, in American memory, Andrew Jackson remained a celebrated figure for generations. To many, he was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, the champion of the common man, the president who stood up to elites. His face would eventually appear on the $20 bill. But beneath the myth of Old Hickory lies the darker truth: a man whose policies brought death to thousands, who defied the courts, and who placed greed above humanity. Even today, debates rage over how Jackson should be remembered. Some see him as a populist leader who shaped American democracy. Others see him as a cruel oppressor, responsible for one of the greatest injustices in U.S. history. The story of Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How can a nation built on ideals of freedom and justice commit such atrocities? How do we reconcile a leader's accomplishments with their crimes? Perhaps the most haunting lesson is this: cruelty often hides behind the mask of progress. Jackson claimed to be protecting native peoples even as he destroyed them. His words framed removal as mercy, but his actions left only suffering. History shows us that leaders can twist morality to justify nearly anything. And it is the vulnerable, the powerless, the voiceless, who pay the highest price. Andrew Jackson's legacy is one of contradictions. He was a war hero and a president who expanded democracy for some, and a tyrant who destroyed the lives of others. The Trail of Tears remains his most infamous act, a scar on the conscience of a nation. It is a story of cruelty, betrayal, and death, but also of resilience, as the Cherokee and other nations survived, rebuilt, and endured despite every attempt to erase them. In the end, Jackson will always be remembered as the cruel president who let thousands die. His vision of progress was written in blood, and its shadow still falls across America today.